Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fourth workshop series on neurodiversity and neuroinclusion. Today's program is called Navigating Identity and Adulthood for Neuroqueer People, sponsored by Equality Mental Health. We are delighted to have you all in attendance to discuss and learn more about the experience of being neurodivergent. Before we begin, I would like to thank the River Edge Public Library for hosting us and for all the wonderful help we received from our mental health agency, Equality Mental Health, a designated psychotherapy practice for the LGBTQ+ community. Today, we will dispel some of the mystery surrounding the concept of neurodiversity. This is a term that many of us have heard before, but may not have much knowledge or familiarity with it. Today, we are fortunate to have an excellent instructor on the topic, Kay Peterman. Kay is a graduate student of public health and social work at NYU University. They have an excellent working knowledge on the subject and also self-identify as being neurodivergent. Kay's past experiences include advocacy and direct support for neuroqueer youth and as a mental health clinician for the LGBTQ+ community. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone on to Kay, and today's program is one where we'll encourage participation, and thank you for being here.
Great, thank you, Craig. As Craig said, today's workshop is on navigating identity and adulthood for neuroqueer people. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Why we're here today. So we're here to explain the meaning of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, go over what it means to be neuroqueer and what that experience is like, explore what it means to be an adult from a neuroqueer lens, and review challenges neuroqueer people may face when transitioning to and going through adulthood and how to support them. In terms of format, feel free to ask questions if you need to. We just ask that if you have a question or you're making a comment that you wait for us to pass the mic to you. Just so that the people on the live stream can hear it. This is being live streamed and recorded so that anyone can access it whenever they need to. Additionally, if at any point it would be more comfortable for you to stand and move around or stim, that's totally fine. We just ask that you move to the back of the room so you're less likely to distract other people. If it would be helpful to look at a copy of the presentation or handouts on your own at any point, you can access them through the QR code that was on the first slide on your phone. I think everyone got those. And then additionally, just some concepts from the previous 3 workshops are going to be referenced here that I'm not going to go into it as much depth as I did with those. You're free to ask questions about those, and also there will be the slides from the previous workshops are available at the end, so you can also read about them in more depth if you want to. Any questions on that? Okay. So our agenda is we're going to have 5 sections and short breaks between most of them and a longer break in the middle. First, we're just going to define language and neurodiversity. Then we're going to go over what neuroqueer means, what the relationship between neurodivergent and LGBTQ people is, and why this link exists. Then we're going to go over neuroqueer experiences and with identity and community. And then we're going to just explore what is adulthood, and specifically what is adulthood for neuroqueer people like. And then the challenges and supports that neuroqueer people can face in adulthood. The challenges they can face and the supports that might be helpful. So just a quick note on language. For this presentation, we will be using identity-first language rather than person-first language for forms of neurodivergence like autism. So this looks like saying autistic person versus person with autism or person with autism spectrum disorder. This is preferred by autistic advocates and many neurodivergent advocates as well, because it emphasizes being autistic or being neurodivergent as an intrinsic part of identity, rather than framing it as something that's separate from them as an individual, or something that could be cured or removed in the way that a disease could. Additionally, instead of describing people as high functioning or low functioning, we will use the terms less visible support needs and high support needs. And this is because functioning labels can erase the strengths or challenges of a particular group and often can essentialize people into those categories. And describing support needs communicates the practical thing that functioning labels is trying to communicate, which is just like the level of support people need without essentializing it or being judgmental. The language in that area is still evolving, so like what is an inclusive term for that will change over time and from location to location. Additionally, instead of nonverbal, we will use the term non-speaking. This comes from the non-speaking community. They prefer that because many of them do have access to words in the form of like, if they have like alternative or assistive communication, so like they can type, they can point at objects to communicate things. They have words, they just don't speak. So non-speaking is more accurate and inclusive. And also just none of these terms will be universally used by everyone in the relevant populations. No community is a monolith. This is just like what is generally put forward by advocates in terms of language.
Can you speak up just a little?
Okay, just a little, yep. Yeah, so now just quickly defining some terms. So first, just what is neurodiversity? So neurodiversity is the diversity of human minds and the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species. And this was said by Nick Walker, who is a trans autistic advocate. So by this, based off of this, neurodiversity is just a biological reality. We all have brains that work in different ways. There are a lot of different ways that happens. Neurodiversity is a separate concept from the neurodiversity movement or the neurodiversity paradigm. The neurodiversity movement is like activism and advocacy on a social and political front for neurodivergent people, and the neurodiversity paradigm is a framework to look at neurodiversity. This is also different from neurodivergent, which is an adjective to describe a political identity. But it is at the root of those concepts. So in comparison, what is the neurodiversity paradigm? The neurodiversity paradigm is a perspective on neurodiversity that contrasts the pathology paradigm. So the pathology paradigm is like autism or ADHD or PTSD are inherently disordered or diseases and things that we must fix. The neurodiversity paradigm, on the other hand, views neurodiversity as natural. It's a valuable biological aspect for humans as a species and the human experience. It posits that there is no singular, normal, healthy, or correct brain. Similar to other standards, the idea that there is one right or best way for the brain to work is a social construct that is inaccurate. In the same way that it is inaccurate, the idea that there is one right or best race, ethnicity, sex, gender, or sexuality is inaccurate. And then based off of that, the social dynamics that result from neurodiversity are similar to those from other forms of diversity. So like with other identity groups, power dynamics form based off of who is in the majority or who has the most power compared to who is in the minority. At the same time, and similar to those other dynamics, embracing neurodiversity in the same way as embracing other forms of diversity can be a great source of strength and creativity for communities. So then within that, the terms neurodivergent and neurodivergence are broad umbrella terms referring to any way that one's mind can differ from the societal standard of normal. And this can include innate forms of neurodivergence, so ones that people are born with, and this can include anything from being autistic, dyslexic, or an ADHDer, or being predisposed to things like anxiety or depression. And they can also encompass things that we probably wouldn't normally consider neurodivergent, like epilepsy and migraines, because those are inherently your brain working differently. There are also acquired forms of neurodivergent. So brain changes due to, these can be results of brain changes due to trauma. Trauma in the psychological sense, or also like a concussion. A long-term meditation practice that actively changes your brain, or even like heavy use of mind-altering drugs. So like someone who's used psychedelics for 20 years will have a brain that functions differently than the standard, and so they have acquired neurodivergence in this way. An individual can be neurodivergent in multiple ways, both innate and acquired. So for example, I'm an autistic ADHDer with migraines as the result of a traumatic brain injury. So I have both innate forms of neurodivergence, because I was born that way, and then also ones that I acquired due to experiences in my lifetime. So just to kind of visualize this, the relationship between neurodiversity and neurodivergence, the entire population is neurodiverse. And then within that, there are neurotypical people based off of a social concept of what is typical, and then there are neurodivergent people. And then within the neurodivergent group, there are some neurodivergent people who are disabled, which are usually the ones that you hear more about because they're the ones that need to advocate for their needs more. And so because of that, it's important to also define what a disability is. So disability is broadly any condition that significantly affects one's ability to do tasks related to everyday functioning. And there are a lot of overlaps between disability and neurodivergent identities. And when considering these, it's important to consider two of the more popular models for disability. So there's the medical model, which is what we typically use and typically hear about. So it considers disability as something to treat and fix. And it's the lens that's most broadly used. So by the medical model, someone in a wheelchair is disabled because of whatever put them in that wheelchair. And that's something that would need to be fixed and addressed in order for them to not be disabled. Then there is the social model. The social model looks at disability as something caused by the environment and social conditions that prevent someone from being able to do basic functions. So by the social model, someone in a wheelchair is disabled by the fact that a building has no ramps. And the thing that needs to be fixed is the fact that there are no ramps rather than the person. The medical and social models are not a binary and will vary between different forms of neurodivergence and disability and also an individual's experience. Generally, people who experience forms of neurodivergence that have more physical effects, like say epilepsy or migraines, usually view it as a disability through a medical model because there's not a whole lot. There are some things socially you could do to mitigate those, but mostly the thing that will help is medicine. At the same time, people who experience forms of neurodivergence like autism and dyslexia, where most of what would help are environmental or social adaptations, would look at it more through a social model. A lot of the time, the view will be a combination of the two also. So like ADHDers are usually getting treated with medication and also would benefit from social changes. And then how different people view their experience on this continuum is going to vary from person to person, even people with the same disabilities or same forms of neurodivergence. So considering like the neurodiversity paradigm is very specifically non-pathologizing and moves away from the medical model, how does that work with forms of neurodivergence that are based off of diagnoses? Like generally speaking, we have identified autistic people, people with ADHD or people with dyslexia by diagnosis. So how does this view that? In general, the neurodivergent community and the neurodivergent movement supports self-identification. Like you are the expert of your experience, you're the one living in your brain. You should be able to tell if you feel like your brain is working differently than what is considered quote unquote normal. So self-identifying with specific labels is okay. The one exception to that would be like not self-identifying with epilepsy or things that have like a physical effect and also a safety concern associated with them. At the same time, it is still considered okay to seek an official diagnosis, like within the neurodiversity paradigm, and encouraged because like that is often what is needed for accommodations. For a lot of people, it can help with self-understanding to get that level of detail about like how their brain works or like a specific framework to look at their challenges or where they might need support. And because of this, for those who want diagnoses, it's considered the evaluation should be more accessible and inclusive. So how does this paradigm and language compare to how you've seen neurodivergence discussed by groups, organizations, people in general? And or if anyone has thoughts, I just ran to a bunch of food, bro.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a generational issue because when I was in social work school, it was drilled into us. It was always person language first, you know, that the person is more than whatever they're dealing with. You're nodding your head too. So it's interesting in terms of the neurodivergent community that identity comes first as opposed to, and I don't know whether it's changed. I haven't been in social work school for a while, but I don't know if it's changed. Maybe you can answer that better.
Yeah, no, in general, like social work school and School of Public Health, they do this. I will say like that framework specifically comes from, and the neurodiversity movement in general comes mainly out of the autistic community, and that's often said in response to the fact that like a lot of the rhetoric around autism that we've all heard recently emphasizes more on like this is a horrible thing and it's worse to get it is worse to be autistic than it is to die from measles, and so we have to fix it rather than recognizing autistic people's humanity and the fact that like yes, our brains work differently, but that isn't inherently bad. It isn't like going to kill you inherently. It's just we might need more support in certain areas. So that is where like that emphasis goes, because and also most of the funding for autistic for things research and just services and organizations related to autism goes to research to cure or prevent autism. which is eugenics, and so the switch to a identity-first paradigm is kind of just to was presented as a way to counter that narrative and push back against that. But yeah, no, it's and also like as an umbrella term, like that's going to vary. Like whether or not people with OCD want to use identity-first language is going to be up to people with OCD. So it is an ongoing discussion.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Any other thoughts or things people have heard, or how this differs?
Yeah, what Dr. Cutler just brought up does remind me of something I learned. There was a case study back when I took Psych 101, comparing different types of, what are called mental illnesses by society, and one of the cases was of an obsessive-compulsive man, I think, and he underwent the most drastic treatment, I guess you could call it, in an attempt to remedy it, which was, it was a surgical intervention on nerve ablation, and all because he considered himself and was told by everyone around him, you are someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, not someone who is obsessive compulsive. And as someone who has dealt with that all my life, I started thinking, because of that kind of narrative, I started thinking, is that what's in my future? Is that what's expected of me to quote-unquote function normally? The reason I pushed back against it personally is because I think it might only be because I've seen that, there are disadvantages, there are advantages too, and I do lean heavily towards the hypothesis that a lot of the things that we consider conditions and illnesses nowadays, well, they stuck around in human evolution for a reason. They offered a survival advantage early on as hunter-gatherers. It would have been very beneficial to be incredibly fastidious and attentive towards cleanliness and things like that. But nowadays, I think it's gotten to the other way around, where if you don't fit into social norms, there's something wrong with you. That's still something that I have internalized and I'm trying to unlearn. But it's hard, I'll be honest.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it definitely is really hard to unlearn that conditioning, and the evolutionary part is definitely like, and what is considered a disability at different points in time is an important point to bring up. Like, one example I've seen is like people who are dyslexic, like 200 years ago when most people didn't have to read regularly, wouldn't have been considered disabled because they wouldn't be forced to do that. And so like the way their brains process things might have been more useful in an environment where literacy wasn't placed at such a high value. And how disabling that is as we're moving into an era where things are more infographics, and that is easier for people who are dyslexic to read. That it might be less of a disability, depending. So like, it is important to like to consider like what is disordered and what is disabling in its societal context, and within the historic context of like why did brains develop this way? Is there something useful to it? Yep.
I was thinking about my education. I studied clinical psychology before studying clinical social work, and I don't think there was enough emphasis on neurodivergency, and I think there has been some new enlightenment and destigmatization of it now that it's autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5, and also it seems more widely discussed, I hope. But I also am thinking of some of my clients, because I'm a therapist, and many of my clients will say, I think that I'm on the spectrum, but I'm not sure. And so it's really, I intuitively think if you think you're on the spectrum, then you very well probably are on the spectrum. And so it's nice to see that that is something that the community has talked about, and it feels good to be able to affirm that it's okay to be on the spectrum and that it's normal, and to kind of look at different ways of approaching communication and thinking that is a little more comfortable. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And yet I'm glad to hear that it's affirming and matches your practice already. Did anyone else have thoughts on this or how it's different? Okay. Just takeaways from this, neurodiversity is a biological reality, and the neurodiversity movement seeks to build a world where all neurotypes can thrive. We defined neurodiversity in comparison to neurodivergence. So one describes the diversity of all people, whereas neurodivergence describes people who differ from neurotypical norms. While neurodivergent people don't all have disabilities, there are many forms of neurodivergence that can be considered disabilities or are disabilities. We also talked about the medical and social models of disability and how they relate to neurodivergent people. And we went over just an understanding of the neurodiversity paradigm as a non-pathologizing model, but also the one where advocates do advocate for increased access to evaluations and diagnoses. Any questions so far? Okay. Do we want to do a break or keep going? Okay. Yes, it is hot in the room. Great. So the next section is going over specifically neuroqueer identities and experiences. And we're going to do this in two parts just so that there's a break in the middle. So what does the term neuroqueer mean? So this also comes from Nick Walker. Neuroqueer, as you can guess from the combination of words, it's a flexible term that's based off of the intersection of neurodivergent and queer theory to address people who are both neurodivergent and queer. As an adjective, it describes individuals and experiences at that intersection of neurodivergence and queerness, but also like because it's based in queer theory, and like queer theory has the whole idea of like you can queer a space and use queer as a verb, you can use neuroqueer as a verb. So it describes actions that actively make the world neuroqueer. So that can be openly existing as a neuroqueer person, intentionally expressing, I don't know why that says quietness, I meant queerness, in a neurodivergent way, or creating or interpreting media in a way that is neuroqueer. So like Percy Jackson is, I honestly think, a fantastic example. Have people heard of Percy Jackson? Yeah, so like it was a series created by Rick Riordan when his son was diagnosed with ADHD. And he created a series about kids who were had ADHD and were dyslexic, and they were struggling in the real world, but that's because they were Greek demigods. And so it actually was linked to superpowers, but also the fact that they would get chased by mythical monsters the whole time. So it's like a interesting take on like the neurodivergence is superpower while also like addressing challenges. Yeah, so I just love that as an example of neuroqueering, and also just actively working to make the world neuroqueer. So we're mainly focusing on the adjective today, so neuroqueer people, like the adjective and the noun. But in having this workshop and the dialogue related to it, we are doing the verb of neuroqueer. We are neuroqueering the world in a way. Why is this important? So like there's a huge overlap of LGBTQ plus and neurodivergent identities. It's long been recognized as by people who work with it, but only recently has been backed by research, mainly with autistic people. So it's estimated 15 to 35% of autistic people are something other than heterosexual, compared to like 4 to 8% in the general population, with a much higher proportion of non-heterosexual autistic people being asexual or labeling their sexuality as other, which is the category that the research created for things like poly, BDSM, it being associating being a furry with your sexual identity, like just a broad category for things that are not generally encompassed with LGBTQ, but are associated with the community, and a higher percentage of them are asexual or other, and some studies say as many as 70% of autistic people identify as non-heterosexual. Additionally, a larger portion of autistic people are more likely to identify as transgender and are more likely to identify as a gender outside of the binary. So that could be non-binary, genderqueer, bigender, gender fluid. One study also found that trans people are 6 times more likely to have autistic traits, though there is some questioning of that because there are some studies that have found that that goes down after HRT, so it could be the overlap of autistic traits and trauma going in there. And there's also some differences in this overlap depending on gender assigned at birth. In general, people who are AFAB and autistic are more likely to also identify as LGBTQ in some way. So that would be people who that would be women who are lesbian, or bisexual or queer in some other way, and also transmasculine people or non-binary people who were assigned female at birth. The reasons for that have not been explored thoroughly, but it's an interesting thing to note. Some preliminary research also indicates that ADHDers may also be more likely to identify as LGBTQ. Similar overlaps haven't been researched in other forms of neurodivergence, but like anecdotally, they seem to exist as well. So why are neurodivergent people more likely to be LGBTQ? Well, there are a lot of misconceptions about this, and that has resulted in many, especially those with more visible neurodivergence or support needs, have had their LGBTQ identities questioned or dismissed on the basis of ableist beliefs, such as neurodivergent people aren't able to understand LGBTQ identities or themselves. Neurodivergent people just see identity as an interest rather than actually being that thing. And also the classic neurodivergent people being manipulated by LGBTQ people in online spaces. You get the 2-for-1 villainizing of LGBTQ people and infantilizing the neurodivergent people. Though that most commonly seems to be thrown at AFAB neurodivergent people recently, and particularly AFAB neurodivergent trans people. The consensus among experts is that none of this is true. But despite this, the rhetoric based in these misconceptions is now being used in policy both in and outside of the US. The UK just announced a requirement for anyone seeking gender affirming care to get evaluated for autism and ADHD, despite that having no effect on the effectiveness of gender affirming care. And then also the Trump on Thursday released a report on gender affirming care that also was proposing things based off of this, even though there's no factual basis for it. It's just fear mongering. Still, like, if none of those are the reasons for the overlap, what is? So there are several theories for why neurodivergent people are more likely to be LGBTQ. Some argue there may be a genetic or epigenetic component based off of research that, like, certain exposure to certain hormones during as a fetus seems to be correlated with being neurodivergent or LGBTQ. But research for that is ongoing. Apart from this, the more popular and visible theory is that it's not necessarily that neurodivergent people are more likely to be LGBTQ, but that they are more likely to be out as LGBTQ because they are less likely to understand or buy into social norms that keep people from coming out. So just because they socialize differently, because they process social interactions differently, they're more likely to be out. Another theory is that neurodivergent people are more likely to figure out that they're LGBTQ, so it's kind of a variation on that. They're more likely to be out to themselves due to something called flattened priors, which I'll go into more in a minute. And then also sensory and general processing differences may contribute to or affect this overlap. So I'm going to go into those last two a little bit more. So first, with flattened priors. Flattened priors is a theory from cognitive science to explain how people process information that contradicts their beliefs. So according to this model, priors are prior beliefs that you hold going into a situation. And the majority of people by this theory have steeped priors, which means they give more value to their past beliefs compared to current information or current beliefs. So like if I go into a situation going the sky is blue and it's night and the sky is black, it's just like, no, it's normally blue, it's just black right now, or it's a really dark blue, trying to tell yourself things like that. Because they put more value on prior beliefs, they require a lot of evidence to question that previous belief. In comparison, neurodivergent people are more likely to have flattened priors, meaning they value prior beliefs and present information more equally, so they'll consider them side by side and take the one that seems more valid in the moment rather than giving the past belief an unnecessary weight. This results in them being more likely to question prior beliefs when presented with information that contradicts it. So the result of this is in this model, if someone with steep priors and someone with flattened priors both have the prior belief, like if you have a penis, you are a man, the person with flattened priors is more likely to question that belief when presented with contradictory information, such as feeling like a girl themselves, meeting a trans woman, or an intersex person. Whereas a steeped prior is more likely to hold on to those previous beliefs, or they might superficially be like, okay, sure, but not actually buy into it or make an effort to understand. Based on this model, neurodivergent people would be more likely to figure out they are LGBTQ+, just because they're more likely to question their prior beliefs, and thus be out to themselves compared to neurotypical people, because they are more likely to question their beliefs when given evidence. That makes sense? Okay. So that's one theory, and then the other one, which is more just based off of neurodivergent people's experiences, is just sensory and cognitive processing differences. It can affect one's identity. So neurodivergent processing differences do seem to contribute to identity, and they also may be affected by some LGBTQ+ experiences. So for example, sensory processing is inherently a part of sexuality, and it is something that is different for neurodivergent people. So neurodivergent sensory needs could influence the fact that, say, a lot of neurodivergent people are asexual, because that is a very sensory avoidant thing to do. So if you're sensory sensitive, which a lot of neurodivergent people are, being asexual makes sense because the act of sex might feel overwhelming from a sensory standpoint. And then in comparison, there's also a lot of neurodivergent people who are sensory seeking or who need extra sensory input in order to be able to regulate their nervous systems and just regulate themselves. And so that's where you also get a lot of neurodivergent people who are into BDSM, because that involves a lot of extreme sensory input that meets their needs. Additionally, a lot of neurodivergent trans and non-binary people report their gender expression having to do with sensory needs as much or more than societal expectations of gender. So there's autistic people who are assigned male at birth that report liking wearing skirts as kids, mostly because they like the sensation of twirling in the skirt more than like considering anything about gender and liking that, preferring that now too. And also there are transmasculine people who will, or even AFAB people that dress in a more masculine way because it feels better to them from a sensory standpoint. I know even for me, like I've had short hair since I was a kid, not because of any gender reason, but just because I didn't like the feeling of putting it in a ponytail. So that can overlap and can be a lot to unpack for people at this intersection of just like, okay, how much of this is actually identity and how much of this is a physical need. There are also terms like outie gender and neurogender and outie sexual and neurosexual for those who feel their sexual or gender identity are inseparable from their neurodivergent one. And like feeling that way does make sense because like if neurodivergence is how your brain and your nervous system process everything, that's kind of inseparable from everything else. At the same time, some experiences like going on HRT can change sensory needs and processing. There's a lot of people that go on HRT in either direction and say that changed how it changed their experience of their neurodivergence. So certain sensations that didn't bother them before might start to bother them, and at the same time, certain situations that were bothering them before might not. Also, just like going through puberty itself can be a sensory hellscape for some people. So like it can also be a stressor. So it's an interesting intersection just in the sense that like your brain affects your identity, but also like identifying something in a certain way or doing things to affirm that identity can also affect your processing. How does your sensory and cognitive processing relate to your gender identity expression, or how does the sensory and cognitive processing of people you know affect their gender identity expression? If anyone has experiences with that.
Yeah, there were a number of things I wanted to bring up, but I'm going to go back to them later. Yeah, I did want to point out what you said before about the neurodivergent people are more likely to figure out that they're queer of some kind. It was actually, I think it worked the other way around for me, because even though I kind of suspected it growing up, you know, my mother did as well, I didn't pursue an official diagnosis for autism until after coming out as non-binary. And that was precisely because I found out about the large amount of overlap, and there was the fact that all of my friends are autistic or some kind of neurodivergent, and you know, people with similar interests and communication needs tend to flock together. And so it actually came in that order for me. How you mentioned that, you know, there's the theory that, you know, maybe autistic traits go down after HRT and social transition. I'm wondering if that might be more due to it being perceived that way due to how both are so heavily medicalized. Like when, you know, in order to access gender-affirming care, you need to have an official diagnosis, gender dysphoria, and that's because they see it as, oh, this is a condition that needs to be cured, which should sound very familiar. And yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Is it just perceived as, oh, look, the HRT is working, like it's curing this, and these abnormal traits, you know, the way outsiders see it, are going down, therefore the autistic traits are decreasing. But I don't think that would make a person any less autistic.
Yeah, okay. So with the first one, yeah, a lot of people are getting that in that order nowadays. Because like you said, neurodivergent people tend to end up flocking together, and same with queer people, because just people with similar needs. The theory is more that like even before you realize you're neurodivergent, your brain is still working in a neurodivergent way. So the way neurodivergent ways work mean you're more likely to figure that out. But yeah, the order can happen in any way. And then in terms of the research, you do bring up a very good point. The research is based off of self-reported traits versus observed ones, and they've said autistic traits because it's not specifically people who've been diagnosed with it or self-identified. They were saying that there were increased autistic traits, even people who weren't necessarily autistic. and that those went down. So like that's kind of the part where it's like there's still some discussion of what that means and how to interpret that. Because like people can have autistic traits without being autistic, and those will change. The different whether or not that means they're autistic is really between themselves, because they and anyone they want to consult with about that. But yeah, any other thoughts, or anyone have any experiences with like your sensory or cognitive processing affecting your identity, or someone who knows?
Can everyone hear?
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time. I don't know if it's just me.
Yeah. Okay, it's
okay.
hard.
If everyone
Okay.
can just speak up. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Should I move closer to y'all?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Now I'll see. Move as close as the wires will let me. Just takeaways from this: neuroqueer is a word that can be used as an adjective or verb when describing or creating experiences at the intersection of LGBTQ and neurodivergent identities. Neurodivergent people are more likely to identify as LGBTQ+. There is some evidence that LGBTQ+ people may also have more neurodivergent traits, and these things vary across gender. This overlap has been misrepresented to make discriminatory policy. And instead of the misconceptions related to that, the reasons for this may be inherent or have to do with differences in social, cognitive, or sensory processing. Any questions on that? Okay. So we have the option for another 1-minute break, or how are we feeling? Okay, awesome. So next we have our second part on neurodivergent identities and experiences. So this is working out identity as a neuroqueer person. So working out and developing identity as a neuroqueer person can be more complicated than just working out an LGBTQ identity or just working out a neurodivergent identity. So when developing LGBTQ identities, some neurodivergent people will work that out very early and be very direct about it. So like they may figure it out and be very clear at a young age, and that's usually people who have the language to communicate that or like have the concepts in hand. And at the same time, some neurodivergent people may work out their identity much later than average due to masking, which is neurodivergent code switching. And a lot of people, especially those who are diagnosed or identified as a neurodivergent later in life, they'll internalize masking and just be doing it all the time, which means they're not in touch with their own feelings because they're so focused on performing neurotypicality that they don't that they're ignoring their own needs. And so that could also lead to ignoring the fact that you're queer or ignoring feelings about gender. They can also figure it out later due to differences in sensory or emotional processing. So like there are the typical stories of what being a queer person looks like, but it feels different to them. So since they don't have the language or framework for their own feelings, they just go assuming they're the default until they get information otherwise. And then also just lack of information in education, which this is more for neurodivergent people with co-occurring intellectual disability. A lot of the time they won't get any sex education or any exposure to these ideas until later in life, just because of a lot of ableist assumptions about their ability to self-identify and their agency as people. So that can also lead to a lot of delays in figuring out identity. Additionally, like neurodivergent people, due to tending more towards bottom-up processing or needing to take in a lot of details in order to build things up to a big picture instead of having a broad concept in their head that they project out into the world. When they figure out they're neurodivergent, a lot of them might spend a lot of time doing research or studying or like going down a social media rabbit hole to figure out what that identity means to them and also how to act in community. It is largely due to that in terms of just placing what this means to themselves and also like what does that word, what does it mean to be bisexual? Just because that is a nebulous concept and they might need a lot of information to place that, but it can also be due to anxiety or concerns around being able to socially fit into the LGBTQ community, because usually you're figuring out LGBTQ identity adolescence or later, and by then neurodivergent people have usually experienced a lot of social rejection just on the basis of having those social differences. So there might be some trauma there and might be a lot of wanting to avoid having those negative experiences again. On the flip side, when developing a neurodivergent identity, for those who are identified as neurodivergent as children, their neurodivergence may be treated primarily as a burden or a pathology. So they might internalize that as being bad about themselves, and particularly because like it's how their brain works, and they can't. They might be able to briefly seem to change it, but there's a lot of that they can't change. And then they also might not receive information on sexual or gender identity, and thus are left confused and frustrated, especially for those with co-occurring intellectual disability. There's also some neurodivergent people who are identified when they're younger, but their parents don't tell them until high school or later or at all, which can also lead to a lot of things where like, oh, I got these services as a kid, but I just thought it was this thing, and now I have to reconcile as an adult that no, that was because I was neurodivergent and everyone knew and didn't tell me, which is a big hurdle in terms of figuring out identity, because there's also a lot of betrayal wrapped up in that. There's also some evidence that children who express gender differently than the norm, so children that are more likely to be LGBTQ+, may be less likely to get identified as neurodivergent as children. And that goes alongside people who are assigned female at birth being less likely to get identified as neurodivergent as children due to a lot of sexism in how those, and a lot of sexism in terms of how neurodivergence has been defined and represented historically. And so it's more, that would mean it's more likely for LGBTQ+ people to have to learn and process a neurodivergent identity later in life, which it can be a lot like processing an LGBTQ identity in the sense that like, oh wait, were there signs when I was a kid, and then having to reprocess all of these stories from their childhood in the context of like, oh, that is because I was a neurodivergent person, or that's because I was a neuroqueer person. So like that can take a lot of emotional effort and a lot of mental labor just to sort through all of that. What has yours or people you've known's experience been working out their identity as a neuroqueer person? If you either are or have worked with anyone at that intersection.
My experience has really been, I think, to the point that it is very blunt, it's very honest, it is a very forward way of thinking and understanding, especially when they realize that they are autistic. There is an immediate kind of like, okay, bet I know what I'm doing now, because it is like a realization of self. And I could at least speak on this in regards to my partner. It is very much so. Once you start living in your truth and you're identifying with that and you are fully unabashed with that, it does come off very just blunt and forward, but that is just, it is what it is. It's like, that's what it is. Yep. So I can appreciate and respect that, because as opposed to masking it, or as opposed to being in the closet and being less comfortable and confident in yourself, there is no other way to process the information than this is what it is. Either you take it or you leave it. So I could at least say it's very refreshing to not have to kind of like deal with a facade. It is just like, this is the truth. This is what it is. So I think it's a beautiful experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, no, it can be very freeing for a lot of people, especially once, for some people it can be very easy, like, oh, this is what it is, and now I don't have to mask, and for other people it can be having to sort out, well, what is behind the mask? But that it can be very freeing and very much relieve a burden of having to perform a certain way. And it is very analogous to figuring out your LGBTQ. Anyone else?
Yeah, I know I brought this up before, but I think it's worth repeating how you said that if neurodivergent or LGBTQ+ identity comes first at a young age, the person may be taught that, as was the case with me, that's everything, and other reasons get overlooked, and then you end up having to learn how to deal with those later in life. You realize, well, maybe those are separate aspects, or could be considered separate categories. The example is that when I was growing up, I was diagnosed with clinical depression, and I was told that's the only thing it can be and nothing more. So when I came down with my chronic migraines and minor mine are probably congenital. The neurologist I had said, oh, that's from the depression, because that was the dominating diagnosis for him. And he said, so treat that and the migraines will go away. I mean, guess what? He was wrong. And you can probably tell that, how something like that can interact with and be informed by being autistic, which I did not know at the time and wouldn't find out many years later. The sensory overload is precisely what triggers those. When I run out of energy at the end of the day, that's what triggers those. Or when I'm sleep deprived, that's what triggers those. It's probably been the explanation all along, but everyone seemed to be steering me away from that. It's very similar to how, when I was questioning whether I might be non-binary, I had people, including therapists, tell me, no, I think it's just depression.
I'm sorry that happened. That is not good therapy. But yeah, absolutely, like, people like to put someone in a box, so like, you're autistic and therefore you can't be these other things, or oh, you're queer, and so like, just the fact that you feel like a social outcast is solely because you're queer and not because of anything else. And that can lead to people overlooking things. And like, I'm really sorry you had that medical experience. And it's also unfortunately far too common to have that, especially at this intersection.
I was just thinking about some of my patients I've had over the years who knew they were queer, but didn't know they were on the spectrum. And then some patients I had who knew they were on the spectrum but didn't know they were queer. So it's interesting to see how both can be part of their identity, of course. And I wonder, it's something I'm going to continue to talk about with my patients, is how does the spectrum part of it kind of inform your identity, perhaps? And this term neuroqueer is new to me, so I'm really very happy to have learned it. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's great to learn words that can describe things. Yeah, no, that's great to hear. Anyone else have anything before we move on? So then there's the other part of this, like, once you have your identity, finding community as a neuroqueer person. So like, neuroqueer people can face unique challenges when trying to find community. So it can be difficult to find LGBTQ spaces that either meet neurodivergent sensory needs. So like, for example, a lot of the time the most visible ones are loud parades or bars. And if you have sensitivity to noise or don't like other people touching you, those aren't friendly. And even like among places like book clubs or online spaces that are more sensory friendly, or crafting clubs, they might not be as accommodating or understanding of social and communication differences, which can lead to going someplace and feeling like you belong and then falling out of it. That will depend on environment and location. Like, that's far more of a risk, say, in an area that is rural or isolated or doesn't have many resources, versus like, we're in the New York metro area, so there are a lot more options. Additionally, neurodivergent spaces and services may not be LGBTQ plus knowledgeable or affirming, which can make it difficult to be in those spaces because you have to sacrifice part of yourself, or you might have to deal with a lot of microaggressions related to your LGBTQ identity. Though this will depend on the space and service, like in this area, that's generally been shifting, and because of the visibility of this intersection, that's generally been shifting, but also a lot of the time, I'm sure a lot of us are aware, healthcare spaces can take a while to change how they do things. So people still can run into this. Healthcare and social services, I should say. Additionally, so as a result of this, a lot of neuroqueer people end up with friend groups with other neuroqueer people. And there's a lot of stories of people not realizing they're neuroqueer and then slowly figuring it out together, that they're all neuroqueer, and oh, that's why we're friends. And this is just because they're more likely to understand each other, be interested in the same things, and just more naturally accommodate each other, because this is how I process things, you process them similarly. Great. So this can often take the form of like Dungeons and Dragons groups or crafting clubs. Like my brother here has a Dungeons and Dragons group that is entirely neuroqueer. None of them knew that when they started, and that's just been going on for 8 years. Then on top of this, individuals at this intersection are more likely to have chronic illnesses or disabilities that can make it otherwise difficult to access or participate in physical community. So that could be chronic migraines, that can be an autoimmune disease, that can be Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, EDS. And it can also just be the fact that it is very draining to be a neurodivergent person in a neurotypical world, and so there's not a lot of energy for going outside. So a lot of people will build their LGBT community primarily online just because that is what is accessible to them, which has the benefit of there is a community, but has the downside of not having that support in person as much in that in-person connection. So what have your experience been finding or creating neuroqueer communities, or people you've worked with or people you've known?
I would say in this area, even though we've come a long way, particularly Bergen County in northern New Jersey, there's still a long way to go in terms of many LGBTQ folks do feel very isolated, and there are not sufficient spaces or opportunities for people to connect. And then you add the neurodiversity, the queer identity, and it's even more difficult.
Yep.
And sometimes you haven't really addressed this, and I don't know if this is something I've just seen anecdotally. Sometimes social anxieties can be quite high. So if there are opportunities for people, so for example, things like this, or conferences, or things that we've done, sometimes people are interested, but I notice that sometimes there's anxiety about actually coming in person. So I think that can add an extra challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for adding that. I did not think to include that in the slides, but yeah, no, that's definitely something that can come up for going to new places in general can be a lot for neurodivergent people because of just it being a lot of new information and that being overwhelming. And then you add a history of social rejection or a history of bad experiences, and you get anxiety and trauma, and that definitely can make it harder to motivate yourself to go somewhere where it can be a risk. Any positive experiences or just experiences falling into a neuroqueer community or seeing one form? Yeah.
We're an open and affirming community of faith,
Okay.
and we have a good number of neuroqueer members, and some with social anxiety. And what we've done is create Zoom space.
Yeah.
So some people are in our physical space, and then for almost all our activities, we have a Zoom option. And I've noticed over the last year or two that a number of our neuroqueer members who would come sometimes to some things, more often than not would opt for the Zoom option. And I'm pretty sure that's a lot about social anxiety,
Yeah.
more so than that the space is not safe or they don't feel welcomed, or it's more of a generalized, I don't like to go anywhere. So I kind of, those members kind of hang out on Zoom more than in person.
Yeah, absolutely. And in general, having hybrid options is generally just a good accessibility practice because it can be social anxiety, it can be sensory overwhelm too of going to new places or sensory exhaustion. Yeah, absolutely. It's fantastic that you're doing that. So if does anyone else have anything for this question? Okay. So based off of this, some general other general neuroqueer experiences that can make it unique. So there's a lot of creativity and variation at this intersection. So you have everything. You have the asexual to BDSM spectrum. You have the non-binary people and the binary trans people. You have poly people. You have infinite variation here. And many neurodivergent people feel very strongly about and take action related to issues that affect their communities due to having value-based identities. So neurodivergent people tend to have base their identities more around their interests and their values because of how they process things, and so that can lead to people who are neuroqueer being a lot more involved with activism or wanting to get a lot more involved in activism and wanting to talk more about issues related to that. At the same time, as with other intersectional marginalized identities, being both queer and neurodivergent can mean experiencing discrimination and bias based off of both of those identities, and sometimes experiencing those two biases amplifying each other. Then neuroqueer spaces, and this is why neuroqueer spaces, whether made intentionally or unintentionally, can be really valuable and also difficult to maintain if they don't support, for say, executive functioning. So like a lot of people will forget where things are or go to the wrong place first, or just have trouble maintaining, like say if you're communicating everything in a group chat, they might find that overwhelming, or have difficulty responding. And so like it might be an otherwise safe space, but just like because everything in life is overwhelming, that falls off of the radar, or they lose track of it, not because they don't value it, but because everything else became too much. And that they can be especially difficult to maintain if individual support needs don't complement each other, or there isn't someone there that's to support. And additionally, difficulties finding communities often make this group more vulnerable to isolation, adverse experiences, and negative outcomes. There's no research on it yet, but just logically, both groups have a lot of risk factors that overlap with each other, and they seem like they would amplify each other. Does anyone have any like neuroqueer experiences, or does that make anyone think of neuroqueer experiences that they've had, whether that be difficulties maintaining groups, experiencing multiple discriminations at once, or having a lot of creativity and variation in identity? Okay. Yep.
In regards to identity specifically, I tend to be very much so like an encourager and an enabler. So I will usually, going back to my partner, like I will basically just like anything they want to do on impulse, I'm like, do it. Which doesn't necessarily help all the time, but I think it's more so just always being encouraging and always being like there. They've been there for me, and I've been there for them in communication ways, because obviously, to circle back, it is very blunt, open, and honest, but then there will be like a slight communication, I wouldn't even say issue, but there's something that just doesn't come out, or there's something that still like persists. So I think it's more so just being as understanding as you possibly can. But specifically to the experience part of that, it really is just like being as encouraging as possible. Because even if there is all the way out there, there is still like a level of, I guess, like patience that you still need to at least like practice.
Yeah, absolutely. What you said actually reminds me of something gone over in the other workshops, the double empathy problem, which describes how the reason that like a lot of neurodivergent communication styles will get labeled as problems or difficult is because they're in the minority, and people who have the majority communication style aren't used to interacting with that, and they don't do the work that you're doing of just making an effort to understand, and instead it falls on the neurodivergent person to do that. So it sounds like you're doing a fantastic job supporting your partner.
Do you have any suggestions in terms of how to expand near neuroqueer communities?
Yeah, so we're actually going to talk about that a bit, but in general, like making an effort to be inclusive of both. So like in LGBTQ spaces, having alternate communication options, following up with people if they do fall off, and making it clear that it's okay that that happens, and that can be helpful for people with executive functioning. Doing things like making spaces hybrid, and also for existing like neurodivergent supports and neurodivergent spaces, being openly LGBTQ affirming, and making an effort to understand LGBTQ identity so that like the neurodivergent people don't have to explain those to you. So like so it takes effort from both ends, and like it's a bit, because like it's such a broad overlap, like it's hard to give specifics without like a specific environment, but generally just trying to match and meet support needs and also emphasize that you're accepting.
Thank you. It's so helpful to hear everyone's comments and thoughts, and your presentation, of course, but I'm thinking now of neuroqueer people I know, and how it can be confused with something like social anxiety or depression, and how it's okay, and it's, no matter what you label it, it's okay to just kind of have that time to not feel overwhelmed and to feel peaceful. But I do know, a lot of neuroqueer folks who are feeling really lonely, because of feelings of rejection and actual rejection, and how hard that is and how amplified that can be for someone who's neuroqueer. So I think it is important to have more groups. Maybe I'll offer a free group for neuroqueer people virtually. I think I might.
Yeah, to add to that, and to add to what you two said, it occurred to me that maybe, as well as how the presentation led into the fact that, groups can fall apart if individual needs conflict, it does strike me that there would have to be less conformity within a group like this. Usually the groups that stick around longer and the ones that almost develop a cult-like mentality, this is the group, and in order to fit in you have to believe this and do this and dress like this and act like this and talk like this, and exert so much control over the members' lives. But those are the groups that boast about, we're so large and we've been around for so long and we're this strong, and and it has a real impact on how they affect political spaces as well. The harder it is for a group to stick together, and the more disagreement and conflict there is, the harder it is to form kind of like that united front. But I've always been one who's believed that it is important to hear out people with different points of view, and it is important to accommodate that. It does not just because you disagree or do things differently from someone else does not mean that you cannot get along, and it does not mean that I've been kicked out of certain groups for disagreeing with them because I was outspoken about my own beliefs, and they didn't want to take that. I think it does depend on how accommodating the group wants to be, and if, because you brought it up repeatedly, accommodation and being aware of the differences that people have is the foremost important step. I think as long as you have that, then that in itself can be the purpose and the reason for the group to stay together, because it's more inclusive. I think that should be seen as a strength, not a weakness. And it reminds me of those studies that show that a diversity of ideas and backgrounds leads to more innovation, leads to more progress. So if anything, that should be a reason to stick together.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great reason to stick to it. And you brought up a lot of great points and your experiences as well. I'm trying to remember them all. I will say it's very common for people to get neurodivergent people to get kicked out of groups either for having opposing beliefs or bringing up when there's a problem that no one wants to acknowledge. But at the same time, like making that effort and particularly putting the emphasis on accommodations and awareness of others' differences, which is also why it's hard to give generalized recommendation, because what people's differences and accommodation needs are can vary widely. So like having an open group can be helpful, but also for some neurodivergent people, they do better with a structured group. So like a weekly book club or D&D group where it's like I come here to do a task and I don't have to worry about figuring out how to socialize here because I know the set social rules. But some people do better with something that is more open and more free. So it can vary greatly, and that's also where it can be hard to create those groups, because there's the intention to be aware and accommodating, but also a lot of needs can conflict too. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, just takeaways from this section. So neuroqueer people may have different experiences with developing identity compared to others in their communities. Additionally, neuroqueer people may have a harder time finding spaces in LGBTQ+ or neurodivergent community that are accessible and inclusive or affirming. Neuroqueer people can have immense strengths, but also face increased difficulties with discrimination, lack of support, and isolation. And because of this, neuroqueer people can often incidentally form communities with each other, but may have difficulty maintaining them. It doesn't mean they're all doomed to, but like just that is something that can come up a lot. Any questions on this section and what was gone over here? Okay, great. So I've made time for a 5-minute break here. Do we want to take a break? Yep, okay, great. So. Great. Paul, are you heading out? Okay. Oh, thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm going to text you in regards to everything.
Okay, awesome.
Bye.
Okay, so like for this last half hour, we're going to talk about specifically adulthood for neuroqueer people, because like a lot of the focus with neurodivergence in particular tends to be like on children. The whole conception of just like there are a bunch of autistic children, but there are no autistic adults, and same with ADHD. They grow out of it, which no. So we're going to just consider what is adulthood for neuroqueer people, which just to start off, what does it mean to be an adult? Any thoughts? You can throw out anything right or wrong. Like when you think of adulthood, what do you think of? Valid.
18.
Okay, reasonable first thought. Yeah, Caroline?
I've only been an adult for like 3 years legally, and this is really reassuring.
Okay, yeah, so generally adulthood sucks. There are a couple ways of conceiving of it. So developmentally, there are several conceptions of adulthood. There's the one of becoming an adult at 18. Psychologically, adulthood is considered when one becomes intellectually and physically mature enough to live on one's own, and that can be viewed as the age of 20 to 25. There's also the whole concept of emerging adulthood, which is the ages of 18 to 30. A lot of these conceptions can be inherently ableist. For example, one that comes up a lot is like your brain isn't fully developed until you're 25, and it's just like who's deciding what developed means. Your brain changes across the course of your lifetime, and it remains neuroplastic across the course of your lifetime and capable of change. It might change a lot more when you're younger, but that doesn't mean that that is what developed is, or that there isn't actually an end goal of that. Many theories also break adulthood into stages. So the one most commonly hear of in, say, social work school, where I am, is Erik Erikson's, which breaks adulthood into young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. With young adulthood being focused on forming close relationships, middle adulthood being focused on whether or not you're productive in life, and late adulthood being focused on reconciling with mortality. Just as some conceptions. There's also just like societally, adulthood is associated with a lot of different milestones. So you think of adulthood, you think of having a driver's license, or getting a job, or pursuing a career, or getting a degree, moving away from one's parents and living on one's own, marrying or moving in with a partner, having and raising kids, owning a home, and saving for long-term goals like retirement. What are any general themes that we're getting a sense of with these theories and conceptions of adulthood? Yep.
Separation and individuation, that
Yep.
there's an expectation that as a young person matures, that they become more self-sufficient, more independent, more capable of doing things on their own, which may or may not be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that is a very American conception of adulthood. In more collectivist cultures, there's less of an emphasis, say, on moving away from one's family. So there is, within American culture and within Western culture generally, there's this big sense of like individualization, and becoming self-sufficient and becoming autonomous to an extent. So the problem with defining adulthood by this. So most of our conceptions of adulthood focus on the idea of becoming entirely autonomous and self-sufficient, or mostly autonomous and self-sufficient, and view not doing so as a failure. So based off of this, many support services and programs, especially for neurodivergent people, focus on developing independence as much as possible, sometimes to the detriment of those they serve, and particularly those that have less visible support needs. They might get pushed more into like masking in order to have a job and be self-sufficient, or like having to figure out how to both have a full-time job and maintain a home when that is far too much for them to deal with. While also having like time to take care of themselves and their health and actually form a social group, and just generally limit their autonomy, and that can lead to burnout, which ultimately further limits their autonomy and independence. An alternative definition of adulthood would be one being able to develop a life they find meaningful to the degree they are able, which is definitely more cross-cultural, and it leaves more room for different people's abilities to be self-sufficient, and doesn't make that like the be-all end goal. So for this, because of like the emphasis on autonomy and self-sufficiency, many in the neurodivergent and disability communities push for a move towards interdependence. So relying on each other for support things rather than being self-sufficient. So this would enable more people to pursue that broader definition of adulthood, so being able to develop a life you find meaningful to the degree you're able, and also having the support you need. And we do have interdependence already in some ways. Like, does anyone know of any examples? So like, say interdependence would be like how taxes are supposed to work. We all pay into like a pot and we all get a benefit from it. It could also be something like, say, a potluck at a church where we're all bringing in a food so that we can have something larger from the whole. So we're all supporting each other in different ways. For neurodivergent people, it could also be look like you have the autistic person who's very good and meticulous with the budget, and the ADHDer who can be very good at cooking or cleaning at certain points, and so they each like do those different tasks that the other one might have more trouble with. It turned off, and now how it works changes. So putting so much value on autonomy in adulthood it leads to a lack of support that often results in neurodivergent people developing neurodivergent burnout. Neurodivergent burnout is a specific form of burnout that is more extreme than what you would normally think of. It's based off of this idea from autistic people where they can develop burnout where they actively lose skills that they had before. So they might say they used to be able to sit at a computer and work for 8 hours a day, and they're no longer able to do that. Or they used to be able to tolerate a certain level of sensory input, and they no longer are able to do that. And losing that ability for 3 months or longer. And a lot of people who fall into this kind of burnout can spend years with that and never actually gain those skills back, even when they aren't as exhausted anymore. And autistic people often experience this after being in an unaccommodating or toxic workplace, or when trying to work full-time will also do other life things without support because it's too much, or during periods when there are a lot of demands and changes in routine or a lot of masking. And then some neurodivergent people like ADHDers can have similar experiences. So it's important to move away from defining adulthood by autonomy just in the sense of like people's long-term well-being for neurodivergent and neuroqueer people. Then there's this other thing where it's like we have these milestones we associate with adulthood, like getting married at a certain point, or getting a license, or getting a degree, or getting a job. And that doesn't always work out the same for queer people or neurodivergent people. And this is where we come to this concept of neuroqueer time. It's based off of this theory called queer time that describes how LGBTQ people can often experience certain milestones at different points in life compared to their peers. So say if you're the only queer person in your town, or the only out queer person in your high school, everyone else will have their first experiences of dating in high school, but you might not have that until college or later. Or say if you're a trans person and you start transitioning in your 20s, you're now going through a second puberty in your 20s, so that's like, or your 30s, and that's inherently like going on a different timeline. Queer time is just like saying that the timeline for life and those milestones is different, is getting queered. Similarly, neurodivergent will often either not experience milestones or experience them on a different timeline. So like say if you're an autistic ACE person, you might not get married. Just might not be in the cards at all. Neuroqueer time is kind of looking at those standard timelines and just viewing them in a different way and viewing, okay, what do you actually want to do with this time? What would be a meaningful part of your, what would be a meaningful way for you to spend your life? So it describes those variations in developmental timelines. It also provides a framework to be non-judgmental about, say, a neurodivergent person not, say, getting really started with a career until their 30s because they had to figure out how to do basic life things first. Or say, never getting a driver's license. So it's like, okay, it's not that that's a failure or you're not meeting a standard, it's that you're on a different trajectory or a different timeline than other people. So it questions whether typical developmental trajectories should be really be a standard expectation for people in general. So what can this look like? Say needing to stay with a family longer, or not being able to work full-time at all, but being able to find part-time or unpaid work that is meaningful and fulfilling. Not meeting several milestones associated with teenage years or early 20s, such as completing school, getting a full-time job, or having a serious relationship until your late 20s, 30s, etc. Not experiencing certain milestones at all, like getting a degree or certification or getting a driver's license, having a significant romantic relationship or children, but still building a meaningful life. and doing well with professional or social milestones, but struggling with other activities of daily living, like maintaining one's home or keeping up with the bills, and thus needing to live with someone or maybe not being as self-sufficient in other ways. So it can look like a lot of different things. How have your experiences or others differed from common conceptions of adulthood? So like, for example, I don't have a driver's license and I'm not gonna get one because my sensory processing and driving in New Jersey are not a safe combination. Anyone else either be on a different timeline or know people who are?
Not having children.
Yeah, not having children.
Not
either.
everybody is going to be having children.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I was nodding when you said some people are asexual, aroace, and raising a family, having children, not in the cards. It never was for me. I mean, I always assumed it was because, you know, I saw, well, just how well my parents got along, and I thought, yeah, I'm not going to bring a kid into that. But no, it's just, or, you know, I thought, well, the advice now is wait until you're past your 20s, you're more mature, and you're more financially stable, so I'll do that. But what I found out from my allosexual friends is that no, you're growing up, you're gonna have these crushes whether you like them or not. You're gonna be interested in certain types of people whether you like it or not, and you're gonna be dropping everything to pursue that. And I thought, no, I can't really relate to that. It's not really, it's not really a matter of when is it best or most convenient. I also wanted to bring up. Yeah, you asked how's adulthood defined? Yeah, social construct very much is. It varies heavily by culture, heavily by individual. This is probably why it was so hard for me to get a diagnosis as an older adult, because they assume that once you hit that magical age of 18, you no longer need support. You can take care of yourself. You're on your own. Tough.
Yeah.
Very much not the case. And yeah, I can also relate to having different milestones, like being early on so many different things, but also being very late to meet society's expectations, maybe even never meeting some of them. And it's been hard for me to accept that that's okay, because I'm reminded of one of the first IOP programs I ever went to. It was back in, it was after a violent incident that happened in 2001. It was run out of Hackensack University, Medical Center, and yeah, it was group therapy. I did find it helpful, but the whole goal, the end goal of that was, we're going to find you employment, or you're going to get employment, and then you're considered done, or you're cured. And if you don't do that, if you don't fulfill that requirement, then we can no longer help you. And those were the terms under which I left them, unfortunately. I couldn't really understand how they would be, supposedly providing for people with different mental conditions, illnesses, and profiles, and not understand that not everyone's going to hit the same milestones or meet the same expectations.
Yeah, no, that's a huge problem, like trying to get people to fit into like this standard expectation of adulthood when like everyone hits those milestones differently, especially people who are neurodivergent and have mental health struggles. Yeah.
I was thinking about pressure as a term, as an experience that defines this idea of adulthood, and how it's so important to transcend the social expectation and kind of look at. I really appreciate that idea of it being a meaningful life, and so there is so much pressure on adolescents, young people to adult and not really being ready to adult, or not knowing how to adult, or and letting that be a process. I know that for myself, I felt a lot of pressure to go to college right away, get a degree, get a job, get a place, get a partner. Like I was just, so I didn't really even think that there were other options. There probably weren't, because I had to support myself. But I think it's so important to help people to, because I do think we are all interdependent. So there should be ways to extend this idea of adulthood. It's a funny term, actually.
Yeah, it is a strange concept, and you're absolutely right, where like a lot of people get funneled into this one pathway, and that doesn't let them explore what's meaningful. But there's also this pressure just from actually needing to support yourself and needing to do the things that like legally should file your taxes, and you have to do that. And there not being a whole lot of options. So like we should be independent, and we are interdependent, but we the way the system's built also can make it hard to live by that alternative, and also increases that pressure. So there are many quick takeaways on this section. There are many conceptions of adulthood that are based on milestones and timelines that prioritize developing autonomy over anything else. This is often not possible or occurs at a different pace for neuroqueer people due to developmental, processing, social, and experiential differences. And having conceptions of adulthood that center interdependence and meaningfulness to that person can be more inclusive of and accessible for people with disabilities. And the conception of neuroqueer time can help to reframe those differences in developmental trajectories as differences rather than failures. Any questions on that section? Okay.
Could I say that again? I was just sort of
Yeah, sure.
lost because there's so much in that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
Do you think that there's a intersection between queerness and non-monogamy that has to do with the interdependence aspect of neurodiversity?
Oh, that is an interesting question. And I mean, I feel like interdependence is probably easier for non-monogamy. I can't speak to like that being the reason why people do non-monogamy, because that's going to vary from person to person. But like, I definitely think the non-monogamy does tend to lend itself more to interdependence, just because like it's a group of people having a relationship with each other rather than just like a one-on-one one.
Thank you.
Yep. Are you good, or do you still need to look at the slide?
Yes, thanks so much.
Okay, yeah, of course. Okay, do we want to take a 1 minute break, or are we good to keep going? Okay. So yeah, now we just go over neuroqueer experiences with adulthood continued, and this is just mainly just challenges and support. So neuroqueer people can have a lot of challenges when transitioning to adulthood. So they can have difficulty developing or maintaining practical skills related to activities of daily living, and just being able to have a life and take care of themselves. They can also have emotional or cognitive challenges that keep them from developing a life they find meaningful. There are challenges with social development and maintaining relationships needed for support and general well-being, and just also the general lack of services and support to have an equitable foundation to build an adult life comparable to others. Just not all neuroqueer people will experience all of these challenges, and also people who aren't neuroqueer also can experience these challenges. So like, for example, with the challenges with practical skills or experiences related to activities of daily living, neuroqueer people can have trouble with those. In particular, like hygiene and maintaining healthy behaviors can come up a lot, just because those require a lot of executive functioning. Remembering to brush your teeth every day, remembering to drink enough water, just requires a lot of executive functioning skills. It can also require unpleasant sensory input. A really common one is having difficulty showering, because just that is a lot of different senses all at once. And also just tasks that neurodivergent people find harder. So that can be things like cleaning, or things that require multiple steps can be hard to do on a regular basis. There can also be difficulty just maintaining a living space and having to clean it. Regular cleaning, avoiding clutter, or doing tasks to get items in a living space repaired can be extremely difficult for neurodivergent people without support. Like usually if you need to get an appliance repaired or something, you have to call 5 people, and each one of those is an executive functioning step. If you need to remember to sweep something every week and you have trouble remembering to do to do that, like it can easily build up over time, and then there can be a lot of shame that builds up over that, and that makes it harder to do as well. Additionally, managing finances can be hard for similar reasons. There's a whole term, the ADHD tax, related to this that is related to costs due to, say, late fees for not paying bills on time, having to replace items you lose frequently, or just making impulse buys. And for any neurodivergent person with executive functioning issues, like that can be a problem. And then on the queer side of things, there can also just be, say, lack of family support that puts you behind other people, and also additional expenses for things like IVF or HRT that can put you behind in finances and like make it harder to manage all of the things. Then there's also just difficulty getting and maintaining employment, and so, there's a large portion of that that's discrimination, but there's also the fact that like a lot of things are full-time jobs that expect you to be there at a certain time in a certain place, and it can be hard for neurodivergent people to be able to do that consistently if there isn't some level of flexibility or accommodation involved. And so that, and then also certain aspects of being professional are just harder. So like writing a professional email, or like dealing with office politics and reading all of the social cues in that can just be inherently more difficult, and thus make working more exhausting if you have to keep up with that. So ways to support that would be finding alternative ways of doing activities of daily living that minimize sensory or executive functioning distress. So this can be things like using sensory-specific hygiene or cleaning products, so like unscented things, or like there's specific sensory toothbrushes that can make brushing your teeth easier, having visual schedules or reminders and alarms, having support people to help, or having alternative options such as multivitamins to supplement a diet if someone only eats the same foods regularly, or like shower wipes and dry shampoo for days that showering is too much. Also exploring neurodivergent specific approaches to tasks. So like the book Keeping House While Drowning by Casey Davis is like one that's generally passed around in the neurodivergent community in terms of like how to keep track of cleaning your home and how to prioritize it in a way that makes sense to neurodivergent people. There's also just accessing LGBTQ+ or neurodivergent learning or career opportunities to build those skills if those are something you want, and also find opportunities, and exploring social services or mental health and medical supports when relevant and available. So going to vocational rehabilitation services or treatment for things like anxiety, ARVID, and sensory processing differences that are causing you significant problems. Then there are also challenges with emotional or cognitive development. General people in this group have a higher rate of mental health problems, usually due to a combination of minority stress and high rates of trauma and victimization, and so that just generally makes things harder. But it can also be difficult getting support or developing skills to regulate emotional or mental health problems, just due to lack of supports that are knowledgeable, affirming, and accommodating. So that can be knowledgeable of how neurodivergent people process emotions, like a lot of neurodivergent people have interoception issues, or alexithymia, which is difficulty identifying emotions, which is kind of a prerequisite for a lot of emotional supports, of you being able to recognize that emotion is getting worse before it gets overwhelming. And if you can't do that, then like it can be actively harmful because you feel like you're failing at dealing with your emotions. And then also there can be services that are not affirming or just not knowledgeable of LGBTQ identities, and so it can lead to more frustration and dysregulation and medical trauma as well with that. Then there's also just experiencing aspects of cognitive development on a different timeline, which means existing tools for certain ages are less helpful. So like Craig was bringing up before with asking questions about gifted people, and I was saying like different parts of the brain, they're developed differently. So like the more critical thinking part can develop earlier for people who are gifted. And so they'll have like the emotions of an 8-year-old, but they'll be thinking about it like a 25-year-old. And most of our tools for 8-year-olds and emotions are not going to be working for them because they're just intellectualizing everything a lot more. And so they need different tools, but most people don't know to give them to them. Additionally, there's just not having and needing more support with certain cognitive skills, such as anything related to executive functioning, so prioritizing, remembering things, et cetera, and just being expected to deal with that on your own, even when that's just not possible for your brain. So supports for that would be taking into consideration individual processing differences with emotional and cognitive support, trauma and culturally informed approaches to mental health supports, explaining the purpose of mental health supports to people so that they are able to understand them and also advocate for when something's different. Like if they know what something is supposed to do, it's easier to point out when, okay, this is not doing this and this is why. and so it's easier to collaborate on that. Considering when someone may differ from typical development in these areas and be willing to adapt supports and communications on that front, and then developing communication supports that better facilitate awareness and regulation, and that could be an emotion wheel, a valence arousal chart, or just there are a lot of different tools for that. Then the other area where there can be a lot of challenges for neuroqueer people is social development. Both LGBTQ and neurodivergent people can experience social exclusion a lot when growing up and in general, and that can lead to delays with hitting typical social milestones or developing relationship skills. Because if you aren't able to have relationships with people, you're not developing those skills, and so you might end up having to develop them later in life, while dealing with a lot of trauma around rejection and anxiety around that. And so this can be worse for neuroqueer people because they then face barriers to finding spaces, as has been brought up, to have these experiences or develop these skills later as a result. And then the resulting isolation and trauma can sometimes become a self-perpetuating cycle that keeps them isolated. So I've now had all these bad experiences, I don't want to go out, and so now, even though I want to be less lonely, and so now I'm just going to stay lonely. And then there's also just executive functioning, burnout, and sensory differences that can make it difficult to maintain relationships. So if when you get overwhelmed, the first thing that drops off your radar is text messages, it might be inherently harder for you to maintain relationships because you're not seeing them from people you value otherwise. And so what can help with that sometimes is a set structure. So having set times when you definitely meet with someone. And that way at least they know okay, I can check in with that and there's not this looming thing if I need to answer that text message or that relationship's over. These are all just different challenges that they can have. So there, in addition to that, there are other ways to support this. So making an effort to make LGBTQ plus and neurodivergent spaces inclusive for neuroqueer people in whichever direction you need to. Having a space for people to regulate in social environments. So this could be having a quiet room or just having breaks and making it clear that those are there so people don't have to worry about it and they know they can access them. Taking time to understand social and communication differences rather than acting based on assumptions, and then also actively making an attempt to accommodate those or take a breath and pause and understand them in the moment as well. And then also just creating spaces where neuroqueer people can have positive social experiences, have positive relationships, and build skills in ways that work for them. There's a lot of neurodivergent spaces that have D&D groups for having social skills or just bonding, because that has that set structure, that set time. It's just there are rules to work within. So there's not as much anxiety, but also you're able to interact with people. And if something bad happens, it's usually happening to your character and not to you. So it lessens the stakes a bit. And also just neurodivergent people seem to like D&D. A lot of information and stats and also creativity. Things like that can help with building those positive relationships in a safe way and an accessible way as well. And then there's just the discrimination and lack of support. There's overall a lack of adequate support for LGBTQ plus and neurodivergent people, and that's then exacerbated for neuroqueer people. People in this group face discrimination in many areas, and such as school, seeking and maintaining employment, finding housing, etc. Neuroqueer people are more likely to have difficulties with family support because LGBTQ, and then also just depending on if the family is accepting of their neurodivergence or accommodating of it, there also can be difficulties with that. And there's a general just lack of adequate services for individuals in this group, especially those over the age of 25, because there are actually transitional services for people who have an IEP or individualized education plan if you're between 18 and 25 to help you transition to adulthood. But then once you're 25, you're screwed. Unless you have a very significant disability, which the bar for that is very high. And so if you grow up having all of that support and then it's taken away, that's that's almost as bad as never having the support at all, because now you have to completely adjust. And then some neuroqueer people also might end up, because of this, feeling like they need to compromise parts of their identity. So I need to stay with my homophobic parents because that's where I get my neurodivergent needs met, and that's what I need to survive right now. So people can be put in these situations. So because of this, pushing back against bias and advocating for neuroqueer inclusion, and especially an expansion of services, is just necessary for neuroqueer well-being, because there is a lot of discrimination, and that negatively impacts people. And we only have a couple minutes left, but does anyone have any challenges that you or neuroqueer people in your life have faced, and what supports have been helpful in those cases, if any? Yep.
You talked about unemployment rates being very high, so the economics become a huge obstacle in terms of people being able to have a meaningful life, because the financial resources to be able to support oneself, become very challenging. So it impacts on health, access to healthcare, being able to purchase or buy what you need in terms of housing options, socialization. So, so in terms of employment and economic disparity, that has a profound impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And like in the last workshop, we talked a bit more about this. There's a 25 to 35% unemployment rate for autistic people, and like LGBTQ plus people, it's better. But like if you're both and you're out as both, like it will be a lot harder for you to find a job, and especially one that is both flexible and pays you enough to live in our current capitalistic environment. Any others? Go in the back.
This is an incredibly small example, but like 3 months ago, I went to the grocery store on a Saturday at 3, parked, and then left immediately because there were so many people, there was so much traffic in the area, and I could not deal with it.
Valid.
So just like a little example of how I've like changed my schedule to adhere to my neurodiversity or neuroqueer. This is just going at times in the grocery store isn't busy because I was so chaotic. Like I could not.
Yeah, no, that's actually a pretty common one. Like a lot of neurodivergent people hate going into the grocery store, and like they'll have quiet hours in the morning, usually for seniors, but a lot of neurodivergent people will try to use those too, because it's not great. And like that isn't necessarily a form of discrimination, but it is just a form of like the system itself just being not friendly to it and making things harder because you now have to rearrange your schedule around that. But yeah, no, there has been some advocacy in that area in terms of like increasing quiet hours for people with disabilities on that front, but I don't think that's hit the U.S. as of yet. So there are changes that can be made here. It's happening slowly, and the current administration isn't helping with anything. But yeah, any other comments on that, or we're at time, so I could just quickly go through the takeaways for this section. Okay, so the takeaways for this are neuroqueer people may have challenges with practical skills, emotional and cognitive challenges, challenges with social development and maintaining relationships, and then all of this is exacerbated by a general lack of support for the community, and that's why it's important to accommodate, support, and advocate for improved inclusion, acceptance, and services for neuroqueer people, neuroqueer adults at all stages of life, and that's especially important for adults because they have generally been overlooked in this area. And we already did a quick check-in. So these are the slides for all of the previous workshops. If anyone is interested, I can keep that up after. If you want to read through those, they went through different things related to neurodiversity, a lot of things specific to how neurodivergent people process the world, different supports that are possible for different challenges, and also just specific adaptations that communities and organizations can make. And specific pain points that can come up there. Yeah, I'll keep this slide up. And then also there's a YouTube channel where there's recordings of all the previous workshops as well.
I wanted to thank Maddie.
Yes, thank you, Maddie, for recording all of these.
For helping us with this. So thank you so much for helping
Thank you.
us.
And also just doubling as our tech person today. Yeah, we'll wait for, I can also leave this up a bit once we're completely done. But we'll wait a minute. If you take a general picture of it, you usually can access the QR codes. Yep, okay, awesome. Okay, so yeah, thank you for coming. And if you access these slides, there's also a bunch of resources at the end as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
exceptionally well done. And on behalf of Equality Mental Health, thank you so much for coming, and to Kay Peterman for presenting an exceptionally well-organized, thoughtful, and practical service to us. So thank you. Thank you. Mhm.
Thank you.